Gators Breakdown, the Gators fan podcast, because there's never a dull moment in Gator Nation.
The Gators Breakdown podcast is ready to go. I'm your host, David Waters, and you can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. And joining me on this episode of Gators Breakdown is Cole Kubek from the SEC Network and former Auburn offensive lineman. He'll give his thoughts on the Gators this season. He was around the team last week as Florida took on FSU for the SEC Network crew. So Cole has a lot of insight on what he was able to see while he was around the staff and the players last week, and a lot of thoughts on Dan Mullen as well and what he's been able to do in his 2-year tenure at Florida. And I'll also dive into the college football playoff rankings and what that means for the Gators' bowl chances. Remember, you can find Gators Breakdown on news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. You'll find all the Gators Breakdown episodes there, as well as News4Jax coverage of the Gators. Also catch the podcast on all your favorite podcast platforms and on social media on Twitter and Facebook at Gators Breakdown. And don't forget, this week will be the last edition of Talking with Troop exclusively at news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. Former Gators tight end Ben Troop joins me to give his thoughts on this season, the big win versus FSU, and what's up next for the Gators. That will be exclusively at news4jax.com/Gators Breakdown. He was in Gainesville last week around the Florida Gators program versus the season finale against FSU, and now joining us here on Gators Breakdown, that is one Cole Kubek from the SEC Network. Cole, thank you very much for joining. And did the Florida State game play out much like you thought it would?
I thought it might be a little more competitive. I thought that those Florida State players would give good effort for Odell. I thought they would, this would be something that they could sort of hang their hat on as far as the season was concerned. But man, it was pretty impressive performance by Florida, especially defensively up front. So maybe a little more lopsided than I imagined. I felt pretty good that Florida would win and would win by multiple scores, but just didn't expect it to be that out of hand that early.
And with that, Florida gets their 10th win in the season, 10-2 in season 2 under Dan Mullen, and looking really, really good for a New Year's Six bowl. Cole, of course, the injuries that happened at quarterback, of course, and around the roster for Florida, but Dan Mullen once again puts together a double-digit win season.
It's really impressive, and when you consider sort of the offensive line that he had to work around this year, and it helps to have the kind of skill that they had, that makes things a little bit easier. But that was an inexperienced group. It was a younger group, and they were still able to find success, and to be able to get some of the quality wins that they did was also impressive. And going to LSU, obviously, it was a tough game, but they're competitive in that game, probably more competitive than a lot of people thought they would be. And they go over there without a guy who I believe, if he's healthy for the entire season, Jonathan Grenard is the defensive player of the year in the league. And then obviously a neutral site game, you kind of go down to Georgia, and one that was, didn't go the way that I think that they wanted it to, kind of got out of their game plan a little bit early, but this has been an amazing season. And I think people looked at that Florida schedule and looked at some question marks with the offensive line and maybe some uncertainty still at quarterback. And I know one of the questions for me that was absolutely answered this year was, the interior of the defense. I thought the edge would be fine. I thought the second and third level would be okay. But, I just didn't know if they had enough depth to really hold up inside for the entire year. And you had a couple of guys, mainly Adam Schuler for the majority of the season. And then, of course, T.D. Slayton came on later in the year that really helped that be almost a strength of the football team as well. So just another great year for Dan Mullen. And I think Florida fans should be thrilled about where the program is and where it's headed.
Cole, what does Dan Mullen do so well that just keeps him winning? For Mississippi State, of course, he doesn't have the roster that he has the last 2 years at Florida, but he still wins there. Of course, he makes the move to Florida, and everybody thinks, the improvement in talent will make him compete for SEC championships. And, only a game behind Georgia this year. But, what is it about Dan Mullen from a wide scope in your mind that keeps him as one of the SEC's best coaches?
He coaches to the talent that he has. He's not stubborn with his system. And a lot of coaches in college football are, hey, this is what we run, and this is how we're going to run it. And they just try to plug guys into that and try to make it work. And I think Dan is the opposite of that. I think Dan, he knew what he had with his offensive line this year. And so he said, hey, early on when it was Felipe, we're going to have some quarterback runs. We're going to try to implement those, and it's going to be a lot of quick throws. We're going to test you on the perimeter, try to loosen you up, make you run, and then we might be able to find some things with our backs a little bit later in the games. And obviously he's going to take some shots downfield as well. But I think the main thing with Coach Mullen to me is that he looks at what he has on his roster, and he looks at who gives him the best chance to be successful and to be explosive. And he's great at creating mismatches, whether it's formations, whether it's motions, whether it's personnel groupings. He's going to find a mismatch. And I think the blessing in disguise with this team when Felipe Franks went out was that Kyle Trask is just an elite decision maker. I mean, he's a guy that when he was the backup prepared like he was the starter, and somebody who, when given that opportunity, was ready and understands how to make the decisions that Dan Mullen wants him to make. He's not a risk taker. And I think you can be successful in a Dan Mullen offense without being high risk the majority of the time. And that's what Kyle Trask is. And to me, the development will come after he and his staff have been there a few years. You'll see that with multiple players. But right now, he knows what he has, and he allows them to go out and be successful and puts them in position to be successful. And defensively, he obviously lets Grantham run that show, but I think he knows obviously what kind of a defense he has as well, and that allows him to coach on offense in a little bit of a different way.
And kind of going, to that example, no better example than more than likely just abandoning the run game kind of midway through the season. He knew it wasn't there. Knew he had, like you said, an elite decision maker in Kyle Trask. And Cole, you've been around
what's interesting about that? I'm going to stop you real quick. What's interesting about that is, and I thought this was a cool quote. He said, he told us when we met with him that we never abandoned the run. And I think that showed up late in the Auburn game. It showed up late in the South Carolina game where they were able to bust off runs late. And the other part that he added to that is he said, we just don't worry about establishing the run. And it's kind of cool if you think about it, because this is a team that I think he knows that they're not going to come out and just on the first two drives hand the ball off 8 or 10 times and all of a sudden get the run going. That's not who they are. But I thought it was intriguing to hear him say that, they never completely abandoned it, but at the same time, they don't worry about establishing it because he knows that they're not that kind of team, but he's never going to be afraid to go back to it. And when you loosen that defense up, when you make them run, when you test their depth, and they know that you can get shots down the field, and you sort of force them to change how they play you schematically, that's when you're able to go hit some of those big runs later in games.
And Cole, we saw it, with the troubles in the run game, just Florida passing game took off. You've been around this team for the last few seasons. How much is Florida going to miss that deep core of receivers of Swain and Hammond and Jefferson and Cleveland? All those guys will be moving on to the NFL. We'll see what Trevon Grimes and Kadarius Toney end up doing. But, of course, it starts with those, 4 seniors that Florida had to say goodbye to on Saturday night.
It's going to be tough. And I think the first thing that you hope is that offensive line does develop a little bit next year, and you're going to be pretty strong at tailback no matter what happens. And obviously LaMichael Pirine is going to move on, but you're going to have a good stable of backs that if you do need to be able to change your philosophy early in games and try to establish more of a run game early on, you might be able to do that. That'll help. I don't expect – I think there's still going to be talent back at that position. And the guy that may help more than anything is Kyle Pitts, and his emergence at tight end was huge for that team, and he's going to be a big weapon next year. And then what does Emory Jones do for this team next year? I'm not going to say that Emory Jones can't be the starter. I mean, hell, I was surprised that he came out of the Auburn game because he went in the Auburn game and started throwing darts. And I was like, well, just leave him in. I mean, he obviously gives you a dynamic running capability, and then now he's shown you that he can throw the football well. Had a couple of nice throws in that Florida State game. So he's going to develop. He's going to improve. He's someone who could help you on the perimeter with a little bit of a run game and creating explosive plays. But I think what they'll miss the most, even past the talent, is the leadership of that group. Because it was pretty cool to hear Hevesy and Mullen tell us, about Jefferson and about Swain and about those seniors. First off, they all play special teams, so they all want to go out and help the team win any way that they can. But they're also unselfish, and that's why you saw certain guys in certain games, whether it was Jefferson would get 8 balls, then Toney would get 9 or 10 balls, and then Swain would get 6 or 7 balls, and some guys wouldn't get any in those games. And there was Dan Mullen told us nobody ever complained, nobody ever moaned, and for wide receivers, that's fairly rare. Obviously, that's one of the diva positions in footballs, but not with that group. And I think that part of that group is what will be missed the most. Yes, they're talented. Yes, they help spread the defenses out, and they give you explosive plays on high percentage throws. But I think the leadership of that group is what Florida's going to miss the most.
And Cole, we'll go to the position. You mentioned them a couple of times here. The position group so well, the offensive line. Is this a group that can, I put it plain and simple, can they get better? I mean, what was the main issue you saw this year? Is this group struggling so much? We know it was the inexperience. We know I didn't have a lot of playing time coming in this year. Is it something that, look, they're probably going to shuffle some guys when spring rolls around as well. What seems to be the main issue and what can be fixed to make this offensive line improve next season?
Well, I think the main issue is just physicality and attitude and demeanor, toughness, finish. Those are things that can be instilled to an offensive line, but a lot of it just the individuals have to want to do it, and they have to want to be those kind of guys. It's just your personality. I think Delance is a guy that has that capability. I think he can be a really good player for him next year. I think Ethan White's a young guy to watch. Brett Hagy's obviously played a lot of good football in a Florida uniform, but has been in and out of the lineup the last few years with some injuries. But I think he's someone who could have a big year next year. So I think there are a couple guys there that can help with that. The main thing that they need, and this is I've kind of pointed to this issue at Auburn for the last couple of years. They need competition. And what you get when you don't have depth on the offensive line, because you're going to have depth at receiver, you're going to have depth at corner and linebacker and running back. So when you see those guys mess up and you see those guys blow an assignment, they usually come right out of the game, right? I mean, if you get a receiver that drops a ball or a receiver that gets a penalty, they usually just plug the next guy in. He comes off the field. Same thing with a DB. So what doesn't happen oftentimes is when a right guard or a left tackle is not playing well or is getting beat or is getting you penalties, you rarely see them come out of the game immediately. But what happens over time is when you don't have competition, that becomes somewhat accepted inside your program over the course of a season. I've seen it happen with multiple programs inside the SEC. And I'm not saying that they're encouraging it, but what I'm saying is they don't have anybody else to put in. And the next guy is so far away from that guy that they have in the game that they can't risk putting him in the lineup. So for me, the main thing that Florida needs is just depth on that offensive line. So if they get someone who's underperforming or they get somebody who's not living up to expectations, you got somebody else that's ready to go in and they can push each other and then they become better because they're practicing at a different level. It means more to them and they're going to do the little things, the extra things to make sure that they stay in the lineup.
Cole Kubek from the SEC Network joining us here on Gators Breakdown. A couple more thoughts from him as we move to the other side of the ball. And up front on the defensive line, you mentioned Jonathan Grenard and the impact he's had just in one season for the Gators. And look, that was without who went out early the Kentucky game and never really came back this season and played a little bit in that Georgia game, but never really got to play up to his potential this season. Cole, man, Gator fans can only wish and imagine what would have happened if both of those guys were on the field at the same time.
Yeah, it would have been fun to watch because they were difficult enough to handle with those guys in the lineup. So to have those guys back, I think, or to have Zuniga back would have been just I would dare I say the best bookends in the league. I think when Terrell Lewis got going for Alabama, he and Jennings were pretty good, but I don't know if anybody else could have thrown two guys like that on the outside and given you one-on-one wins. And when you combine that with what Schuler and Campbell and Slayton were doing inside this year, maybe more than most of us expected, that would have made it easier on those two to be able to wreak havoc. So, and what they had on the back end obviously helps a lot as well. So I hated it for Zuniga because I think he's been a guy that he's done everything the coaches have asked him to do when he's played down inside a little bit when they go to a bare front and sort of giving him a bit of a presence in there, a little more quickness in their jet package. And obviously the guy that can hurt you off the edge. So they'll both be missed. Grenard is just, he's a next level guy. He is a next level talent. And like I said before, I believe that if he would have been healthy the entire season, we'd be talking about him as the SEC Defensive Player of the Year.
Cole, a lot of along that same theme, coulda, woulda, shoulda. In the middle of the season, they had Florida travel to Baton Rouge, and could not get pressure on Joe Burrow, and they hit some big plays. And then the Georgia game, Georgia converts third down after third down because they weren't able to generate much pressure there. And then the big plays as well that kind of just gave it away late in that Georgia game. And Florida was just so close. And look, and it's against two teams that are playing Saturday in the SEC championship game. It's just another testament. But we look. And we'll go back and look at if this defense just could have made a couple more plays in the two biggest games of the season, it could be Florida that we're talking about Saturday.
Oh, there's no doubt. And I think that still comes down, like we were talking about with the offensive line, just depth, just building more depth. And I think you saw towards the end of the year a couple of guys that are probably going to help in the future. I mean, Diabate is going to be a guy I think he's going to be a killer, whether they back him up and put him inside or he's got, I think Grantham wants to play him inside next year, but he's got such a quick first step off the edge. I think you're going to have a hard time keeping him from being your edge rusher and maybe even your buck linebacker next year. So you saw late in the season some of those guys coming on that could help a little bit more, but this is why Dan's a good coach. I mean, he put Florida in position to be SEC East champions, and that's where you want to be. And you give yourself a shot in those big games. You put yourself in position to win those games. Enough times, things are going to happen the right way. So Florida builds more depth. That's why I said when he was hired, he's going to win a national title at Florida. I believe in the way that he builds his programs. I believe that in the way that he coaches. I believe in the way he manages his staff. And I think he can do more with less. And he should be able to get more at Florida than he was able to get at Mississippi State. So I'm a fan of Dan Mullen, and I think he has proven for the second consecutive year why he's worthy of being discussed as one of the better coaches in this league.
All right, last thought from you, Cole. SEC championship games coming up Saturday. LSU and Georgia in Atlanta. Who you got in that game and why? And is LSU one of those top teams that you think can, or well, of course they can. Do you see them winning it all in the end?
I think they can, especially with the way their defense has played the last few weeks. I think Joe Burrow is just that good. I think his weapons are that good. And you kind of mentioned the inability to be able to get pressure when Florida played them. It's like even when you do pressure him, you have to think about the circumstances there. Number one, you got a guy that can get the ball out quick. Number two, you got a guy that utilizes his tight end and his running back with quick routes. So he's not afraid to check down. He knows when he needs to get rid of the ball. Number three, his offensive line's been playing pretty well. And number four, you got a guy that's elusive. I mean, he uses his legs extremely well. So people forget Joe Burrow was their short yardage back last year. So his ability to leave the pocket, move around in the pocket is something that's going to make it difficult for teams to pressure him. I think it all comes down to LSU's defense. And if they can play up to their potential, and I think that they're starting to sort of mold into shape here late in the year. Dave Aranda hasn't had the same 11 on the field very much. Now that continuity is starting to come along, starting to grow. Patrick Queen's playing good ball at linebacker. Obviously, we know how talented the secondary is. And you've got Rashard Lawrence, you've got Glenn Logan, you've got Tyler Shelvin, Apuika, all those guys up front are now in the lineup together and healthy, and they haven't had that much of this season. So I think that's allowing them to grow a little bit. I've got LSU this weekend. I love the Georgia defense. I love the way they play. And I think one of the games that they really proved to me how good they were was that Florida game when you saw what they did in coverage. They were outstanding in coverage in that game. So the third level of that defense can play ball. But I think even if you limit LSU, you're talking about 21, 24, 28 points. And I don't see Georgia being able to go get that with how inconsistent Jake Fromm has been, how he's been missing deep balls, and then the weapons that he's going to be without in the first half and for the entirety of this game, on top of the fact that offensive line has not been truly dominant the last 2-3 weeks. They've been great in pass protection, but hasn't been truly dominant in the run game. And if Swift is not close to 100%, that hurts Georgia as well. It just feels like a lot of things sort of weighing against Georgia heading into this game. And LSU actually, when we thought they peaked like back in the Alabama game, they may actually be peaking even more now. Like they've ascended another mountain here in the last 2-3 games of the season. So I'll go LSU, and I think they have every opportunity to go win a national championship with the quarterback that they have, the way the O-line's playing, the weapons around him, and the defense coming along. I think they have every shot to go out there and win a national title.
Well, Cole, last week in Gainesville was the last SEC network game on Saturday night. So What's your plans for this weekend as the schedule winds down?
Well, actually, I'm going to be over in Atlanta. I'm going to go to the game. A couple friends of ours asked us to go, and I didn't think my wife would have any part of it. And she said, "Yeah, that sounds like a blast." So I'm thinking, okay, I get to check the box of being social with friends, and I get to go watch a really good football game. Like, sign me up for that. So
Absolutely.
I'll be a part of it. Yeah, we're going to go check it out, and I'll probably just drive over for the day. But should be a good game.
Sounds good. Cole Kubek from the SEC Network joining us here on Gators Breakdown. Cole, thank you very much.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it, man.
On Tuesday night, the latest edition of the college football playoff rankings were released, and a little bit of a surprise for our Gators, coming in at number 9, and very, very important there because Alabama, after their loss to Auburn, dropped all the way to number 12, which leaves Florida as the highest-ranked SEC team in the college football playoff rankings. That's not currently in the college football playoff Final Four. Of course, LSU and Georgia are in the top 4, with Ohio State number 1, LSU number 2, Clemson at number 3, and Georgia at number 4. And the reason that's important for Florida to be the highest-ranked SEC team right now is because that really looks good for Florida to be in the Orange Bowl. Of course, Wisconsin is in front of Florida right now at number 8. But you would assume Wisconsin's going to lose to Ohio State, and then that will drop Wisconsin below Florida, and Florida will be the higher-ranked Big Ten or SEC team left, and pretty much guarantee Florida in the Orange Bowl. The Sugar Bowl is a possibility as well. If Georgia was to upset LSU, Georgia and LSU more than likely would both make the college football playoff. Florida, being the higher-ranked SEC team, would then go to the Sugar Bowl. With a loss for Georgia in the SEC championship game, that would slide Georgia to the Sugar Bowl and then Florida to the Orange Bowl as well. So pretty much, if Georgia was to get blown out by LSU, I guess there's a slim chance Florida could get the Sugar Bowl, as they would. I don't know if they'd jump Georgia in that situation or not. We have to see what the College Football Playoff Committee would think there. But with Georgia holding the head-to-head win over Florida, I would assume Georgia would still be in front of Florida. They'd head to the Sugar. And then with Florida being the next highest-ranked SEC team, would then go to the Orange Bowl and probably play Virginia there, who will play Clemson this weekend in the ACC championship game. And then we'll see. I think the Orange Bowl is contracted to take an ACC team, and Virginia would probably be that team. Though they are, they're ranked in that 23rd. We'll see how much they would drop after losing to Clemson, but you wouldn't think all that much. Pretty much an expected loss there, but pretty surprising. Penn State, Florida did jump Penn State in the latest rankings, with Florida at number 9, Penn State at number 10. So that's important because if Wisconsin was to beat Ohio State, Wisconsin, I think, they would be in line for the Rose Bowl. And since Florida is in front of Penn State, that would send Florida to the Orange Bowl as the higher-ranked SEC or Big Ten team there. So that's why jumping Penn State was very important there to get the Orange Bowl. If Wisconsin loses to Ohio State, I would assume that would send Penn State to the Rose Bowl as the higher-ranked Big Ten team after that. So a lot to kind of shuffle there. If Florida was to get the Sugar Bowl, they would play the winner of the Big 12 championship game if that team doesn't make the college football playoff, and that would be Oklahoma or Baylor. If they were to make it, and one of those teams were to make it, Oklahoma or Baylor were to make it to the college football playoff, then we'd play the loser of that game in the Sugar Bowl. So a lot to look forward to this weekend coming up for the way or the opponent that Florida could end up playing in a New Year's 6 game for the second year in a row under Dan Mullen. I'm the host of Gators Breakdown, David Waters. You can find me on Twitter at GatorDave_SEC. Guys and girls out there, thanks for listening to this episode of Gators Breakdown.